What is up, guys? So Crisis on Infinite Earths is finally back from its month-long break at this point with part 4 and part 5. In this video, I'll be reviewing part 4 and I'll be posting my part 5 review either later today or maybe even tomorrow, depending on what I'm able to do in the end. But in this video, I'll be reviewing what is probably the best crossover episode ever, and probably also the best episode of this crossover, part 4, which is the Arrow episode. With that in mind, let's begin with the review. So the episode begins exactly where I expected it to begin, with the origin story of the Monitor, as Mark Guggenheim did tell us that that's where the episode will begin. Now, it was only 5 minutes, which is not as much as I expected. I certainly expected it to be maybe the first 10 minutes of the crossover, and I think if it was, maybe would have given more time to develop the relationship between Novu and his wife, and maybe the rivalry between the Monitor and the Anti-Monitor, which wasn't really expressed at all in these 5 minutes. However, I do think that it's fine, since the rest of the 35 minutes definitely, I think, needed all that time to show us what we were given in this very episode. But this origin story was certainly very interesting. I think that it also had some very cool visual elements to it, and it's clear that they replaced Krona with the Monitor. In the original comics, it was Krona, one of the Guardians of the Universe, who was actually from Multis, who went back to the Dawn of Time and looked at the Dawn of Time, and this created the multiverse as well as the Antimatter universe and the Anti-Monitor. Here, they replaced Krona and the Guardians with the Monitor, which I think has its ups and downs. I think it connects better to the Crisis storyline a little bit more. I think it develops Novu and his connection to the Crisis a little bit better than the original comic. However, and this is something that wasn't necessarily a benefit for the comic, but it would have been a benefit here, that would have, I think, been a great way to incorporate the Green Lantern side of the whole universe into all of this, with the Guardians, Krona, and then later also the Green Lantern Corps, as literally the only time we ever get any Green Lantern Corps related stuff in this crossover is a cameo at the end of part 5, where they show Earth 12, which I'll get to in that video. But I think that it has its ups and downs, but for the actual Crisis, I think it works a little bit better, honestly, to make it so that Novu was responsible for the original creation of the Anti-Monitor and the Antimatter universe, and probably also, it does seem, the multiverse. But after the first 5 minutes of the Monitor's origin stories, we get to the vanishing point where we see Ryan Choi. He's the main character in this exact moment, as he's narrating what all of the other Paragons are doing, and also what they're doing wrong. But he and Lex Luthor are creating this teleportation device to get them out of there, which is all pretty interesting. I think it definitely shows where they are at this point fairly well. But then Barry Allen does return from the Speed Force and reveals that there's really no escape from where they are. Which is all, I think, a very good way to just start the episode and show where all the Paragons are. But then it shows Oliver finally, after 9 minutes of this episode of Arrow, we get to see Oliver, and now he's become the Spectre. Jim Corrigan forces him to go through, to relive his entire vigilante career. We see him fight basically every villain, except for Ricardo Diaz and Amico Queen, but I'm pretty sure we see every other main villain that he's fought, and it's really cool to see him relive all that, as Jim Corrigan says that this has all been leading up to this fight with the Anti-Monitor, and this is where Oliver actually learns about the Anti-Monitor, as Novu he didn't want to tell Oliver about the Anti-Monitor, saying that he would be better off not knowing who he's fighting so that he can prepare for any situation, which is kind of ridiculous, and I think Jim Corrigan's way of going about it is certainly, it makes more sense. But this is all really cool, seeing Oliver as the Spectre, and his role in this episode as the Spectre is also really awesome. And Oliver reunites with the Paragons, and we finally, in this episode, get a lot of screen time between Oliver and Barry. Certainly not as much as we got in Elseworlds, which was a lot of screen time between Oliver and Barry, which was, I think, the best part of that crossover. In this one, it's something that we didn't really get much of. In part 2 and 3, they had literally no screen time together as far as I could remember. In part 5, Oliver didn't appear for the most part. It was really only in part 1 where they had screen time together, but even then, it was kind of few and far between. So it's cool to see in this episode, part 4, where they do get quite a bit of screen time together, and Oliver is the Spectre, so it is kind of different, but it is still almost equally as interesting and almost equally as fun as this scene right here, where Oliver reunites with the Paragons, tells them what they need to do and who they're facing, and Oliver asks Barry if he trusts him, and Barry says, since he is Oliver, that he trusts him with every cell in his body. It's really, really cool, and these are two characters that it's just always so awesome to see them on screen together. And there was actually more to this scene that was really interesting. For one, the Spectre basically unlocked Barry's full potential, which he's been building up to for the entirety of the show, which I feel like he reached in Season 4 with the Enter Flash Time episode, and then even in Season 6, where he's pretty badass throughout the first couple episodes of the season. But here, he wasn't able to run out of the vanishing point and time travel back to the dawn of time, but now he is able to, and that's, I guess, the full potential that Oliver unlocks. But other than that, there wasn't really much of Barry that we saw at his full potential. Like, he's been more powerful, like in Enter Flash Time and even in earlier episodes of Season 6 compared to this, so I honestly really hope they play with that. However, unlocking Barry's full potential as a speedster, and seeing that in the second half of Season 6, but there's one other thing from this very scene that's pretty awesome, as after Oliver tells them what they need to do and unlocks Barry's full potential, he tells Barry to run, Barry, run, which was obviously awesome. So Supergirl, Ryan Choi, and Lex Luthor go to Multis when the Monitor was going to go back to the dawn of time, and there's not really else to talk about there, it's just I have to mention that. But then we see something pretty awesome. So the Paragons are lost in the Speed Force, and Barry goes to find them. He does have this talk with Oliver, another scene where they share together, and again, it is awesome. But then he is told to go back to places where he has a strong connection to other Paragons, so he goes to Star Labs, even though none of the other Paragons are from Star Labs, but I guess he has a strong connection to that place, and this is definitely, I think, probably the most surprising moment of the entire crossover, since somehow, some way, they didn't leak this, but Ezra Miller's Flash from the DC Extended Universe has a cameo. And this moment is absolutely insane for so many reasons, for three main ones. The first one is, I never thought in a million years the DC Extended Universe would ever cross over with the Arrowverse, and yet in this very scene, it does. That's one big one. The second one is, how the hell did they manage to bring Ezra Miller, who's basically a movie star, into the CW show, which is obviously very, very low budget for the most part. I'm guessing he wasn't really paid very much, or he was really excited to play the Flash again, so he did it for practically no money. But it's insane how they managed to do that. And third, they managed to keep this a secret, which is the biggest thing for me. Like, all the other cameos were either leaked, or they confirmed it, or they announced it, or there were some set photos or whatever, but this is the only one, for the most part. Like, there are others later in episode 5, really, kind of, but this is the biggest one by far, that they somehow managed to not only actually do it, but they managed to keep it a secret, which is absolutely insane to me. And while I'm not exactly a fan of Ezra Miller's The Flash, I think Grant Gustin's is way, way better. It is still pretty awesome to see these two characters on screen together, and for the DCEU to actually cross over with the Arrowverse. I also think their interactions are pretty cool, like how Ezra Miller's Flash literally just gets the name Flash in this scene, and also learns of the multiverse in this scene, and also he mentions Cyborg, and both Flashes are, like, they are admiring each other's costumes, but Grant Gustin thinks Ezra Miller's is very protective, and Ezra Miller thinks that Grant Gustin's is comfortable. It's just a really, really fun interaction, and by far the craziest cameo of the crossover. I should also mention that right when we get to the Speed Force scenes, basically every scene in the Speed Force and every scene where they go back to previous events in the Arrowverse has this different, like, more cinematic aspect ratio, which honestly, the moment it switched from the regular, like, TV aspect ratio to this one, which they also use on Batwoman, it definitely, I think, made it all more cinematic. And while I don't think it affects Batwoman very much, I think here, because of how big this crossover is, it honestly would have been a lot better for the most part if it was all in this more cinematic aspect ratio in part 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, not just in the Speed Force scenes. I don't necessarily know why they made it this aspect ratio here and not in the rest of the episode. Like, it was, I think, a little bit, not very much, but a little bit jarring, switching from the TV aspect ratio to the movie aspect ratio of this episode. It wasn't as jarring while watching the episode, but afterwards, like, taking screenshots from the episode, it was a little bit weird, and I don't necessarily know why they did it. And honestly, I just think they should have done this aspect ratio for the entirety of the crossover, since these scenes were visually really cool, and they just felt a lot more cinematic than the rest of the episode and the rest of the crossover. So I'm going to stick to the Speed Force storyline for now, and I'll get back to the Multis stuff after I talk about the Speed Force storyline, because I don't want to like flip-flop back and forth like they did in the episode. But the Paragons are all scattered throughout the Speed Force. There's John and Kate, who are focused on, as they do have similar elements here, as they both go to a scene where Oliver is distrustful of somebody, or somebody is distrustful of Oliver, and then they reflect on how Oliver grew since then. John goes to Invasion, where I will say he gets to be in his Martian form for 1 second, which is nothing. I mean, it's not really anything, but at least it's 1 second. However, he does get more in part 5, so that is that. But Oliver, it's the scene where Oliver is telling Supergirl where she should stay behind, and now it's reflecting on how Oliver has grown since then, and Oliver has become a very close ally of Supergirl, and vice versa, and actually a close friend. And John mentioned that. There's also Kate, who goes to Arrow Season 3, which is actually the first of 2 Arrow Season 3 appearances in this episode, which is crazy. But the scene where Ray is saying that Oliver's like the criminal, or Oliver's the menace of Star City, or Starling City at the time, and how Oliver is distrustful of Ray and vice versa, and Kate reflects on how that changed in the future, where those two are again close friends and close allies. And I really like that. It really shows how Oliver has grown since those scenes and those storylines, and also it definitely, I think, honors Oliver and his eventual sacrifice, and also his last one. So Barry goes to Elseworlds, where we also see Superman, Lois, and Green Arrow. Superman and Lois, this is their only clip in this episode, their only scene in this episode, as they recreate these shots from Elseworlds, where Oliver stops John Deegan. But I think this is pretty cool. Like, Lois mentions how Barry got this new costume, which I think it would have been cool if, like, we see the old Barry, the Elseworlds Barry, and they reflect on how much better his current costume is, as the Season 5 costume, even the updated one we got from Elseworlds, or right before Elseworlds, is just so much worse and generally pretty terrible compared to his current costume, and I'm so glad that they actually got this new costume right in time for the crossover. But anyway, this is obviously another cool scene where Barry reminds Oliver about what's going on and basically brings him back out of the Speed Force, and then he also brings back everybody else, starting with the White Canary. And the place Sarah went to was, or the time, I guess, was when she was dead during Arrow Season 3. I'm guessing it was like Arrow Season 3, Episode 2, where we get to see Laurel. Seeing Laurel is cool, but I would say I'm disappointed with the fact that this is her only role in the entirety of the crossover. Not this version of Laurel, this is the Earth 1 Laurel, who I expected to be dead, and I didn't expect to have a role until it was announced that she would. But even, like, without that, the Earth 2 Laurel should have had a role in this crossover. I went into that in other videos, and this is probably my biggest source of disappointment with the crossover. But other than that, this scene was pretty cool. It's crazy to me how we keep on going back to Arrow Season 3 in this episode. It's like a similarity would be Thor: The Dark World, which is a movie that nobody really likes, and yet the time heist in Avengers Endgame had a huge focus on Thor: The Dark World. Arrow Season 3 is a season that where, again, not many people like, and yet the time heist has a huge role, or the Arrow Season 3 has a huge role in the time heist of this. So I definitely think that parallel is interesting. It's just a crazy coincidence, in my opinion, that Arrow Season 3 was so focused on in this, I guess you could call it time heist, or these Speed Force flashbacks of sorts. And that's basically it for the whole Time Heist storyline, which is a storyline that I definitely really liked. Again, it is similar to the Avengers Endgame storyline, the Time Heist, which is certainly not my favorite part of that episode, and this is definitely not my favorite part of the crossover as a whole, but I really like what they did here. I think visually it was all really cool. The aspect ratio they used was very, very cinematic, and it worked very, very well, and I liked how they paid respects through Kate and Jean, through their parts of this, to Oliver, and how he's grown since those events of Arrow Season 3 as well as Invasion. So all in all, I think the Time Heist storyline was pretty great, but then there's also the side storyline with Alex, Kara, and Ryan, which every time they switched back to that one and they went back to the TV aspect ratio was a little bit unusual, a little bit jarring, and it wasn't enough to limit the episode or cripple the episode at all. I don't think it affected the episode very much, but I think the storyline was certainly not as good necessarily as the Time Heist stuff while it was all going on. So on Multis, right as the Monitor is about to go back to the dawn of time, Lex Luthor obviously betrays the other Paragons, which is kind of expected, but it is still really cool as Lex Luthor has, I think, a great rivalry with Supergirl. Like I mentioned in basically all the reviews I had for Season 4 of Supergirl, and then whenever I talk about it, that Lex Luthor had a very good rivalry with Superman in that season, even though he didn't appear, Superman that is, didn't appear whatsoever, because Lex Luthor's hatred for Superman worked very well. However, I do now admit that Lex Luthor had a great great rivalry with Supergirl as well, and that's definitely something we see in this crossover, as they are basically the only hero-villain duo we see in this crossover from the previous season, since Reverse Flash, sadly, literally doesn't appear whatsoever, which I think that for the overall storyline actually works better than if he had appeared, and he would have not have fit in here, in my opinion, but it is still a little bit weird that he didn't appear at all. But I will say that Lex Luthor and Supergirl in this storyline specifically have a great rivalry. So Lex does convince Marnavu to help him, which, I mean, Marnavu's, like, his characterization here, which we get to see a lot more in this storyline specifically, is very different from the one we get to see 10,000 years later, which makes sense since not only is he 10,000 years younger, but also he hasn't gone through the storyline of creating the multiverse, I think it was, and also at least creating the Anti-Monitor and the Antimatter universe, and also everything leading up to the Elseworlds event, and then the Crisis. So it makes sense that he would be a lot more naive, and obviously a lot less experience, so he would be able to be convinced by Lex Luthor specifically. But then we also get, like, Supergirl and Ryan show up. They try to stop Lex Luthor. Ryan convinces the Monitor to not create the multiverse, not go back to the dawn of time, which turns out to not really matter at all, as the Flash and the Spectre does bring the entirety of the Paragons back to the dawn of time, which it's all still happening. The Monitor's still around. The multiverse is still destroyed in spite of the efforts of Ryan, Supergirl, and I guess Lex Luthor, but not really. Still though, while I think that whole storyline was easily, I think, the weakest part of this episode, it was still interesting seeing that younger Monitor, and also the rivalry between Kara and Lex is always pretty cool. So the last couple minutes of this crossover, the last couple minutes of this episode, I mean, are just so great, so much better than I could have ever expected. Looking at the trailers, honestly, this whole sequence of events of them being at the dawn of time, which is actually technically not the dawn of time, it's the dawn of time in the Antimatter universe, didn't look as good as it ended up looking. Like in the trailers, I thought the green tint was weird, the lack of the CGI made it all look a lot worse than it would end up looking, so I didn't really expect much from this, but going into the episode not expecting much, I was blown away by how great this final battle really was, as it was really exciting. The visuals were a lot better than I could have ever expected, and this is basically exactly what I would have wanted for the final battle with the Paragons fighting the Anti-Monitor in the dawn of time. Like, yes, I would change certain things, like who the Paragons are, which I made a whole video about right after the first 3 parts aired, but from what we got going into the 4th part, this is basically exactly what I would have wanted, except I guess the Anti-Monitor and the Spectre don't grow big. And the final fight also between the Spectre and the Anti-Monitor, even though they didn't grow big, it was visually spectacular. The visuals and the CGI were so well done, and it was definitely very intense and very exciting. And it ends with the Spectre defeating the Anti-Monitor, and Oliver dies for the 2nd time. The first time when I watched the first episode, the shock value of it all, I think, clouded the emotional value, and also it wouldn't make sense for Oliver to die in the very first part, so that one wasn't as emotional, especially on the first watch. On the second one, it certainly was, but this one was something completely different. This one was more final. This one I knew was going to be the actual end of Oliver Queen, and I wasn't as shocked. I knew it was coming, so it was, I think, like, the shock value didn't mask anything, and the fact that I didn't think that he was going to ever come back, at least in the crossover, didn't mask anything either, and this is just pure emotion. And I will say it's probably the most emotional death scene in the Arrowverse ever, like Iron Man in Endgame, where the hero sacrifices it all to defeat the villain so that the heroes or the rest of the world and the rest of the universe, or for Oliver, the rest of the multiverse, can live on. It definitely worked perfectly, and this was incredibly emotional, and probably the most emotional death scene ever in the Arrowverse, which is deserved since Oliver Queen is the best character in the Arrowverse, and, you know, it's named after him. But as Oliver dies in Sarah and Barry's arms, the multiverse is reborn, now as a new multiverse, a multiverse where Earth 1, Earth 38, and the Black Lightning universe were never separate, and a multiverse where every other universe in the multiverse, or most of them, some of them, are different. As we see in Part 5, Earth 2 and Earth 19 are drastically different than they were in the real multiverse, while Earth 9, and I'm guessing other universes, are at least similar. But this is just awesome. I wanted for something like this to happen for a very very long time, especially with Earth 1 and Earth 38, which are two halves of the same whole, and then you just add Earth Black Lightning in there, and you add even more to this, which is, at this point, basically a complete main DC universe in the Arrowverse, and this was awesome. You have the ending of Part 3 with the destruction of the multiverse, but the ending of Part 4 with the rebirth of the multiverse, which is more similar to the Flashpoint reboot than the Crisis reboot, is awesome. And I say it's more similar to Flashpoint because at the end of Crisis there was no multiverse left, and it was a combination of 5 different universes, while at the end of Flashpoint there was still a multiverse left, and if I remember correctly, it was the combination of 3 different universes, and that's the DC universe, Vertigo, and I think it was Wildstorm or some other third universe. Putting all those 3 universes together, you get the New Earth, or the Earth Prime of the New 52. So it's basically like they took the Crisis on Infinite Earth storyline and adjusted a little bit, but took the ending of Flashpoint, and what you have here I think is absolutely awesome. So in conclusion, Crisis on Infinite Earth Part 4 is probably the best episode of the crossover, probably the best crossover episode ever, and I'd give it a perfect 10 out of 10. So anyway, that's my review for Part 4 of Crisis on Infinite Earths. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.